Okay, so moving on to section 4, we're going to talk about homeostasis and how that is maintained by negative feedback, but we're also going to talk a little bit about what positive feedback is as well. So what is homeostasis? Basically, is our ability to maintain a relatively stable environment despite our external environment and the changes that we're continuously experiencing. So it's a dynamic state of equilibrium or balance that we're always readjusting as we need, because we have to keep things within a very narrow range in order for our body to function correctly. And all of the organ systems in our body help contributing to us maintaining our homeostasis or our equilibrium. So the body must constantly be monitored and regulated to maintain homeostasis. So how do we do that? That's primarily responsibility of our nervous and our endocrine systems. So in that they provide the means of communication, either in neuroelectrical impulses or by hormones acting as carriers. So all homeostatic controls are going to require at least 3 components, and the 3 components are a receptor, control center, and effector. So when we talk about the receptor, that's going to be your sensor that's going to monitor your environment and respond to stimuli. Once it responds to the stimuli, it's going to send information along an afferent pathway to a control center. Once we reach the control center, that's going to determine the set point at which the variable is going to be maintained, and it's going to basically analyze the information that it received from the receptor and determine the appropriate response. Once it determines the appropriate response, it's going to send the information along an efferent pathway towards the effector. The effector then is going to receive that information and provide a means in order to respond to the initial stimulus, and the response can either be to reduce the stimulus, so that it either shuts it off, which would be negative feedback, or to enhance the stimulus so that it continues at even a faster rate, in which case it would be positive feedback. So this right here is basically showing you the 3 components for homeostatic controls. We have our receptor, our control center, and our effector. So I told you previously that the receptor sends information along an afferent pathway to the control center, and then our control center sends information out an efferent pathway towards the effector. These are not just talking about homeostatic controls. You'll see afferent pathways talking about connections to different things, but afferent pathway is basically one in which it's approaching, and in this case it's going to be the control center. So the afferent pathways approaching the control center, and the efferent pathway is exiting. So that's how you cannot get those confused. So exiting in E, approaching is going to be A. So we have our initial stimulus here. That's going to be received or perceived by the receptor. The receptor is going to send information along the afferent pathway to the control center. The control center could be any organ in your body. A lot of times it's somewhere within your central nervous system, but it could also be an organ like your pancreas if we're talking about insulin control. Our control center is going to process the information that it received from the initial stimulus to determine what it should do or what its response should be. And then it's going to send its information out along the efferent pathway to our effector, who will actually respond to whatever the initial stimulus was. So then we have negative feedback, and negative feedback is going to be the most common or frequently used feedback mechanism in the body. So response is going to either reduce or shut off the original stimulus. Variable changes in opposite direction of initial stimulus, basically in an attempt to return it to some sort of baseline or ideal value. So a really good example is body temperature. So if we get too hot, things happen, or if we get too cold, things happen. But the whole point of negative feedback when we talk about body temperature regulation is to bring us back down or back up to the 98.6. So we want to go in a certain direction. Same thing with the regulation of blood glucose by insulin. This is a hormonal feedback mechanism. So, as we have an increase in blood sugar that can be sensed by receptors in our blood vessels, that's going to cause our pancreas to secrete insulin in the blood. And once we have insulin in the blood, that's going to cause the cells to absorb more glucose. If the cells are absorbing more glucose, we are lowering the amount of free glucose in the blood itself. There's also other examples like breathing, regulation of our blood pressure, or even our heart rate. Most of the time, our body is acting to bring it back down to some sort of ideal value. That's negative feedback. So we can look at the temperature one a little bit more closely. We have receptors, again, right here that they're showing you. These would be receptors that are sensitive to different temperatures in our skin. We also have them in our brain. So we'll perceive that temperature change in our sensors, send the information along our afferent pathway to our control center, which in this case is in our brain, specifically our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus will process it, send the information out along the efferent pathway. So in this case, our temperature increased. So it's going to cause our sweat glands, which would then be the effectors, to cause us to sweat. The opposite would be true if we were cold. So if our initial stimulus was cold body temperature, that would also be sensed by temperature sensitive cells or receptors that are present in our skin or our brain. We're going to send the information from our receptors along an afferent pathway to the same control center, our hypothalamus, which is going to process the information so that in this case, we actually send the information to our skeletal muscles that are going to cause us to shiver, which is going to cause our body temperature to rise or to increase. So again, if we're talking about negative feedback, if we go in either direction, we're trying to bring it back to some ideal value. That's very different from what we talk about positive feedback. Positive feedback is we're going further away from the baseline. So if we use temperature as an example of positive feedback, saying we got hot, positive feedback would make our body temperature go up even higher and even get hotter, not trying to bring us back down to some sort of ideal value. So positive feedback is basically going to enhance or amplify the original stimulus. You can exhibit some sort of cascade or amplifying effect as a feedback causes variable to continue in the same direction as the initial change, so causing it to move further away from the baseline or the original value. Not a whole lot of examples when we talk about the human body, but there are two that you'll talk about in AMP2. One is oxytocin, which acts to intensify labor contractions during childbirth. So, and then once oxytocin intensifies labor contractions actually cause more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contractions in itself. So that's one example of positive feedback. Another one is blood clotting. So platelets are fragments of cells. So if we have an injured blood vessel, they'll begin to accumulate at that site, and platelets actually will release chemicals that attract more platelets. The more platelets will come that release chemicals that attract even more platelets. So actually, let me show you a picture right here. So we have some sort of injury to a blood vessel right there. That's going to begin our positive feedback cycle, where we have platelets that are going to begin to adhere to the site of damage, and they're going to release these chemicals that are going to cause more platelets to come to the site of injury. And this will continue until we have completely plugged the area of the injured vessel down here.